mail-order bride arrived to a flooded ruin, but a battle-hardened ranger carried her through the water. The wagon wheels had barely reached the edge of his land when the bride realized something was terribly wrong. The driver pulled up short, water rushing across the muddy trail in a fast, churning stream that swallowed the ruts ahead. And where she expected to see the small frontier cabin described in the letters, she saw only the sagging outline of a roof, half submerged in brown, swirling floodwater. Her breath hitched as she climbed down, boots sinking immediately into cold muck that seeped through her stockings, the hem of her mail-order dress dragging heavy as she pushed a wet curl from her cheek and tried to understand how the home she'd traveled weeks to claim had turned into a drowned ruin overnight. Wind whipped the soaked bonnet around her face, stinging her skin with grit and icy spray, and the driver muttered an apology she barely heard before snapping the reins, eager to escape the deepening water. His wagon splashed away, leaving her stranded in the rising current with nothing but a small trunk, half filled with the few possessions she dared carry west. She took a step toward the flooded porch, but the ground shifted beneath her, mud sucking at her boot, water slapping hard against her shins, and fear surged so suddenly she froze, unable to tell where the solid earth ended and the collapsed boards began. A distant shout cut through the wind. She turned. A man on horseback emerged from the tree line, coat soaked and rifle slung across his chest, his expression sharpened by the kind of alertness that came from years of surviving storms far worse than this. The horse fought the current, hooves churning, and the rider dismounted quickly, boots splashing into the water as he scanned the ruins with a hardened clarity that told her he knew exactly how dangerous the flood had become. She tried to speak, but the cold stole her breath, and before she could form a single word, the current surged higher, tugging at her skirt and nearly pulling her sideways. The ranger crossed the distance in 3 strides. He didn't shout instructions or demand explanations. He simply reached her with a steadiness carved from battles she couldn't imagine, braced his stance, and caught her arm just as the trunk slipped from her grip and vanished into the flood. Her gasp broke against the wind. "You can't stand here," he said, calm, firm, voice roughened by cold but controlled. Then, without asking permission and without a moment of hesitation, he lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, turning his body into a shield against the rushing water. She clutched his coat instinctively, breath shuddering as he stepped deeper into the swirling current, carrying her toward the only path left. The ruined home disappeared behind them, swallowed by the storm. Water surged around his legs with the force of a living thing, cold and relentless, each step a battle against the swollen current, yet the ranger held her as if she were the only steady element in a world turning to water and ruin. She felt the strength in his grip, not tight, not claiming, just certain, one arm beneath her knees, the other bracing her shoulders against his chest, his soaked coat clinging to both of them as the wind whipped hard enough to sting her eyes. She tried to speak, to tell him she could walk if he set her down somewhere safe, but the moment she twisted slightly in his arms, the current surged again, slamming debris against his thigh with a thud that made her breath catch. He didn't flinch. He only tightened his stance and shifted her weight higher, keeping her clear of the cold that could steal strength faster than fear ever could. "Hold on," he said. Not an order, not a command, just quiet direction shaped by the voice of a man who'd carried others through storms before. She gripped the edge of his coat, the fabric rough beneath her trembling hands, and tried to steady her breathing as he angled toward a line of half-flooded fence posts that marked the rise of safer ground. The ruined cabin behind them groaned under the weight of the water, boards bowing inward, a piece of roof tearing free and drifting like a dying leaf across the current. Her heart twisted. Weeks of hope dissolved in a single glance. But the ranger didn't let her linger on it. "Home can be rebuilt," he said, surprising her with the way he seemed to hear her thoughts as clearly as the storm. "Not if you're swept under." He pushed forward. The water climbed to his knees. His boots sank with every step. Yet he moved with the grim steadiness of a man whose body had already learned endurance the hard way, whose past battles had taught him that fear had no place in moments where another life depended on clarity. When they finally reached the higher bank, he set her down with slow care, ensuring her feet found solid ground before he released her. A release that felt less like letting go and more like giving her the right to stand again. Her legs buckled anyway. He didn't reach to steady her until she lifted a hand in permission, and only then did he offer his arm, letting her use it for balance without pulling her closer than necessary. Breathless, drenched, shivering, she looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude she couldn't begin to name. "You came for me," she whispered. The ranger's gaze swept the flood, his jaw tightening as he studied the shifting water. "Storm wasn't about to take a bride on my watch." He wasn't smiling. He wasn't boasting. He was simply stating a fact, as steady and unshaken as the ground she finally stood on. The wind softened just enough for them to hear the drip of water from the ranger's coat, each drop falling with the steady rhythm of a clock marking the end of danger. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, their breaths rising like faint steam in the cold air as the storm clouds dragged themselves slowly across the sky. She stood trying to catch her balance, her soaked dress clinging heavily to her knees, her bonnet hanging limp by its string, while he adjusted the strap of his rifle and checked the slope behind them for any new surge of water that might rise without warning. When his eyes returned to her, there was no question in them, no demand, no judgment, only the silent confirmation that she was still alive, and he intended to keep it that way. She opened her mouth to thank him, but the words tangled inside her. Choked out by the shock of the day, and instead she simply met his gaze, letting the weight of everything she couldn't say settle between them like a humbled truth neither needed to explain. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, the kind of acknowledgement a man offered when he understood fear not as weakness, but as something earned in hard moments when the world stopped giving choices. Without speaking, he shrugged out of his soaked coat, heavy as it was, and draped it over her shoulders with a gentleness that surprised her more than the rescue itself, careful not to brush her skin more than necessary, careful to leave space around her, as if he knew she needed room to breathe after being carried through the flood. She pulled the coat tighter, the warmth of it lingering faintly from his body, and when she glanced up again, he was already scanning the horizon for safer shelter, jaw set, posture straight, every line of him shaped by discipline rather than pride. She didn't know his name. He hadn't asked for hers. Yet the silence that settled between them wasn't awkward or cold. It was steady, almost grounding, a quiet exchange between two people thrown together not by choice, but by the raw insistence of survival. A fallen branch drifted past in the shallow edge of the flood, turning slowly like some mute reminder of how quickly the storm could have taken her. And when she shivered, he tipped his hat slightly toward the distant ridge and began walking, letting his steps signal what words didn't need to. "Follow me. You're safe for now." She followed him up the narrow ridge, her boots slipping in the mud as the wind pushed at her back, and each time she stumbled, the ranger slowed just enough to let her regain her footing without making her feel watched or fragile. The higher they climbed, the more the land revealed its wounds. The creek had swollen past its banks. Trees leaned at crooked angles with their roots exposed. The fence line had vanished beneath surging brown water, and the ranger's ruined cabin below looked less like a home and more like a battered raft clinging to the last breath of earth. Her chest tightened at the sight, guilt pricking her unexpectedly. This place was supposed to be hers now, a promised beginning. And instead she had arrived as another burden added to the storm he already faced. He must have sensed the shift in her breathing, because he glanced back, eyes scanning her expression with the same measured calm he used on the flood, as if reading the terrain of fear on her face and mapping a path around it. "This land has taken worse beatings," he said, voice low but steady, almost swallowed by the wind. "It'll stand again." She nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it, and when thunder rolled faintly across the distant hills, her hand tightened around the edge of his coat, still wrapped around her shoulders. The ridge narrowed, and ahead of them a section of ground had collapsed, leaving a jagged drop into swirling water that frothed and snapped against broken branches. The ranger stepped forward first, testing the edge with his boot, his weight shifting carefully as he gauged the stability of the sodden earth. A crack split through the mud. He jerked back just as a chunk of ridge gave way and plunged into the water below, sending a spray that stung her cheeks. The force of the moment stole her breath, and she swayed instinctively toward him. He didn't catch her, didn't presume to, but he lifted his hand, palm open, offering balance instead of control. She placed her fingers against his, just for a heartbeat, long enough to steady herself, and then away again as he guided her toward a safer path curving behind a cluster of stubborn pines, still rooted firmly despite the storm. The fading light pressed against the clouds, turning the world a muted gray-blue, and the ranger paused to study it with a soldier's awareness, calculating how much daylight remained before the cold became another enemy they'd have to outrun. "We need higher shelter before dark," he said quietly. It wasn't fear in his tone, it was certainty. And though her legs trembled and the world felt broken around them, she found herself believing him. They reached a bend in the ridge where the land dipped unexpectedly, a shallow basin now filled with floodwater that stretched across their path like a cold, murky obstacle daring them to attempt it. The ranger crouched at the edge, fingers brushing the surface as he measured depth and current, with the quiet precision of a man who had learned to read danger the same way others read maps. The temperature alone made her shiver. The water was darker here, stirred by runoff from the higher slopes, and though it wasn't as violent as the creek below, it still shifted with an undercurrent strong enough to pull at anything unsteady on its feet. She hugged his coat tighter around her shoulders, dread settling in her stomach as she imagined slipping, falling, vanishing beneath the cold that had already numbed her toes through soaked stockings. The ranger rose slowly, wiping his hand against his sleeve as he turned toward her, his expression calm but decisive in a way that told her he had already made the choice she feared. "Walking it isn't safe," he said, voice low but steady beneath the wind. "The ground under there is soft. One wrong step and it'll take your legs out." She nodded, though her throat tightened. Before she could ask what alternative they had, he stepped closer. Not abruptly, not confidently, but with a deliberate respect that reminded her of how he had carried her through the earlier surge. "I'll take you across," he said. Not may I, not I have to. Just a simple statement of what survival required. She hesitated only a breath, then gave a small nod. That was all he waited for. With controlled care, he slipped one arm under her knees and the other around her back, lifting her again as if the weight meant nothing against the strength carved into his body by years of hard miles and harder storms. She braced herself against his coat, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the unshakable balance in his stance. He stepped into the basin. Water climbed to his shins instantly, swirling around them with surprising force, tugging at his boots, soaking his trousers in an instant. But he moved with unbroken rhythm, planting each foot with deliberate pressure, shifting her weight higher whenever the current nudged too insistently against him. She remained silent, not out of fear but out of awe for the steadiness that didn't waver, even when a submerged branch knocked hard against his leg, and he had to pivot to keep his footing. When they reached the far side, he set her down slowly, as if making sure the earth beneath her was worthy of receiving her weight. For a heartbeat, they stood close, breath mingling in the cold air. Then he stepped back, giving her space the moment she found her own balance again. Proof that his strength had carried her, but his restraint had kept her dignity intact. The wind quieted to a low moan through the pines as they reached the higher slope, a pocket of land untouched by the worst of the flood, where needles carpeted the ground and the air felt still enough for her shaking to finally catch up with her. She sank onto a dry patch near a fallen log, breath trembling from cold and exhaustion, while the ranger stood a few steps away, scanning the valley below with the vigilant posture of a man whose body had never quite forgotten the habits of battle. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't rush toward her or hover over her. Instead, he let the silence settle, giving her the dignity of steadying herself without witnesses, his presence close enough to protect, but distant enough to let her breathe. She watched him through damp lashes, noticing how the fading light caught on the scar across his jaw, how his shoulders rose and fell slowly as he assessed the land like a soldier reading a battlefield for threats others wouldn't see. When he finally turned toward her, their eyes met, not with expectation or apology, but with a mutual acknowledgement of everything the flood had already demanded from them. He approached quietly, each step measured, stopping just close enough to extend a folded canvas he'd pulled from his pack, holding it out for her without brushing against her fingers. She took it with a small, grateful nod, wrapping it over his coat to seal in what warmth she could find. The gesture should have been simple. Instead, it felt like a conversation made entirely of breath and restraint. He crouched then, testing the dryness of the ground and positioning a few branches to block the chill wind, his movements efficient, instinctive, shaped by a lifetime of surviving nights far worse than this. She wanted to ask his name. She wanted to offer her own. But the words hovered on her tongue like something too delicate to break. And when he glanced at her again, a brief, almost imperceptible, softness crossed his expression, as if he understood that for now silence was safer than speech. A distant rumble drifted across the hills, not thunder this time, but the settling groan of water withdrawing, and the ranger's attention shifted toward it with the sharp focus of a man already planning their next steps. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In the stillness between them, she felt something she hadn't expected amid cold, ruin, and loss, a sense of steadiness, quiet and fragile but real, carried in the space where words had not yet dared to form. Night pressed in slowly, dimming the forest into shades of blue and charcoal, and the air grew colder with every breath she took, each exhale a thin ghost drifting upward before disappearing into the needles overhead. The ranger worked with steady precision, clearing a small patch of earth and striking flint with the kind of practiced economy that made even the simplest movement seem intentional. Sparks flared, caught on dry bark he had somehow shielded from the storm, and soon a modest fire flickered between them, its glow touching his weathered features and softening the edges of the fear she had been carrying since the moment the flood had swallowed her promised home. She watched him from across the light, arms wrapped around herself beneath the borrowed coat and canvas, and felt a tightness coil in her chest. Not the terror from before, but something quieter, more complicated. She had feared a rival, feared disappointment, feared the stranger she was meant to marry. Yet now, sitting across from a man who hadn't claimed her, hadn't questioned her, hadn't even brushed the back of her hand without permission. She realized the thing unraveling inside her wasn't fear of him. It was fear of needing the safety he offered, without asking anything in return. He glanced up, noticing the tremor she tried to hide, and shifted a little closer to the fire so its warmth pushed toward her without him intruding on her space. "Cold like this'll sit deep in your bones if we don't fight it early," he said, voice low but unforced, as if he'd spoken the same truth 100 times to desperate travelers stumbling out of storms. She nodded, the firelight catching the wet strands of hair clinging to her forehead. "I didn't expect—" She stopped. What had she meant? She didn't expect ruin? A flood? A stranger who acted more like a guardian than a husband? He didn't press her to finish. Instead, he looked into the fire, jaw easing slightly. "Storm seasons change the land faster than any of us can prepare for," he said. "But a home can be rebuilt. A life can be steadied." His tone was factual, not hopeful, yet the words wrapped around her like something steadier than warmth. She realized then that she wasn't just grieving the loss of a roof and walls. She was grieving the fragile dream of finally belonging somewhere. And somehow, this ranger, with his worn boots, scarred jaw, and quiet endurance, had become the only thing in the ruined landscape that felt anchored. The shift unsettled her. It also steadied her. She pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders and breathed a little deeper beneath the fading echoes of the storm. By morning, the storm had loosened its grip, leaving a heavy silence over the valley, the kind that follows destruction and waits for someone brave enough to acknowledge it. The ranger led her down the ridge cautiously, every step measured as they navigated a world reshaped overnight. Trees leaned where they shouldn't, fences lay buried under silt, and the creek, once a thin ribbon, had swollen into a wide, restless channel cutting across the road that led toward town. As they neared the crossing, voices drifted on the damp air, sharp and urgent. A small crowd had gathered at the flooded bank. Farmers, traders, women clutching shawls around their shoulders, staring anxiously at the waters where a supply wagon had stalled midstream, its wheels stuck deep in mud that hadn't been there the day before. The horses pawed frantically, struggling against the pull of the current, while two men shouted conflicting instructions from the bank. One glance told her the wagon would tip if the wheel slid even an inch further. The ranger's jaw tightened. Without hesitation, he handed her the coat he'd carried for her, placing it over her shoulders with a firm nod before stepping toward the chaos. "Stay back from the edge," he said. Not commanding, just protective, the same way he'd spoken through every danger the night before. The moment the crowd saw him, whispers rose. "That's the ranger. He's the one who survived the canyon floods 2 years back. He'll know what to do." But another voice, older, sharper, cut through the hopeful murmurs. "He led a rescue once that cost 2 men their horses," the man said. "Let someone else handle this." The doubt spread quickly, tightening the group with unease. She felt a sting of anger she hadn't expected on his behalf. The man who had carried her through water meant to kill her now stood accused by people who hadn't seen the strength she had seen. The ranger didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. Instead, he stepped into the water up to his knees, calm as if the current were nothing more than wind brushing past him, and reached the struggling horses, laying a steadying hand on each trembling flank. His voice, low and controlled, carried across the water. "Ease them forward, one step at a time." The men obeyed instinctively despite the accusations thrown moments earlier. The horses responded, shifting weight, finding footing under his guidance. Slowly, inch by inch, the wheels broke free. The wagon lurched forward toward solid ground, pulled by the very animals who moments earlier had been moments from collapse. When the ranger stepped back onto the bank, soaked again to the knees, the murmurs changed. Doubt dissolved into awe. And she watched the crowd's faces shift as they realized what she had learned in darkness. He was a man whose actions spoke louder than any rumor. The wagon rolled onto solid earth to a chorus of relieved shouts, the tension in the air snapping like a rope finally cut free. But before gratitude could settle, the same sharp-tongued man from moments earlier stepped forward, boots splashing in the shallows, as he jabbed a finger toward the ranger. "Lucky turn," he muttered, loud enough for all to hear. "But you still cost men their horses in that canyon, Flood. Folks don't forget." The ranger didn't rise to it. He simply wrung water from his sleeve and stepped aside, as if the accusation were rain sliding off a rock. But she felt heat ignite beneath her ribs, a fierce, protective spark born not from romance, but from truth earned in mud, darkness, and survival. She stepped forward before she even realized she'd moved, the borrowed coat hanging loose around her shoulders. Her hair tangled from the storm, yet her voice steady despite the gathering eyes. "You weren't there," she said, facing the man who looked at the ranger as though he were a risk instead of the very reason the wagon stood upright. "You didn't see him carry a stranger through a flood when the ground gave way under our feet. You didn't see him keep me breathing when the water rose higher than my waist. You didn't see him step into danger before thinking of himself." The crowd shifted, surprised murmurs rippling outward like small waves. The man scoffed, folding his arms. "And who are you to speak for him?" She drew a breath, not for boldness but for clarity. "I'm the woman who arrived to a home washed away. The woman who had every reason to die yesterday. The woman who lived because he acted without hesitation." She turned to the ranger then, not for confirmation, not for reassurance, but because truth deserved to be spoken, looking at the one who had earned it. "If this town doubts him, let them doubt from dry ground. But I'll speak for the storm. He stood between us and the water didn't win." Silence settled heavy and complete. Even the skeptical man's expression faltered. One of the wagon drivers cleared his throat, stepping forward with a respectful nod toward the ranger. "He saved my team," the driver said. "That's the only thing I'll remember about today." More nods followed, quiet but meaningful, the kind that reshaped a crowd without needing applause. The ranger's gaze flicked to her, surprised, softened, but still restrained, before he looked back to the people who had doubted him only moments earlier. He didn't bask in their approval. He simply nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, and turned toward the rising ridge. She followed him without being asked, knowing now that the truth she had spoken aloud had changed something neither of them yet knew how to name. They climbed back toward the higher ridge as the morning settled into a pale gold that washed gently over the ruined valley, revealing the storm's scars in clearer, quieter detail. The ranger led with his usual measured stride, glancing back only when the trail narrowed, ensuring she navigated the mud safely. She followed without hesitation now, breath steady, the night's fear having softened into something calmer, something shaped not by the loss of her home, but by the certainty that she hadn't faced any of it alone. When they reached the pine clearing where they had rested before, the fire's remnants still slept under a drift of ash, and the ground felt firmer, less hostile than it had in the dark. She sank onto the fallen log, pulling his coat tighter around her shoulders, while he checked the surrounding trees for fallen branches that might threaten the path down. The silence between them held no tension now, only an unspoken understanding carved from shared danger and unclaimed promises. Finally, he returned to her side, kneeling briefly to test the dryness of the soil near the fire pit, his hands steady even after everything the storm had taken from him. There's a temporary shelter a mile east, he said quietly. A ranger post. Not much, but it's warm, and you'll be safe there until the land settles. She studied him, noticing how the early light softened the scar at his jaw and caught in the darker strands of his hair. You keep talking like my safety is your duty, she said, though there was no accusation in her tone. He paused, eyes meeting hers with a clarity that surprised her. It isn't duty, he said. It's just right. The simplicity of it struck her harder than any oath could have. He wasn't promising her anything. Not a rebuilt home, not a future, not a claim of any kind. But the steadiness in his words, the quiet honesty, felt like the first piece of solid ground since the moment she stepped off that wagon. She rose slowly, the coat slipping slightly from her shoulders, and he adjusted it with the same careful respect he had shown since the moment he lifted her from the flood. Together they turned toward the east, where the ridge sloped into gentler land, and the sky blushed with the first true colors of dawn. They walked in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because the peace that followed survival had its own language, one spoken in steady footsteps, shared breath, and the quiet knowledge that two strangers had crossed a storm and come out carrying more than the water could ever strip away. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you saw a stranger soaked and shivering after a storm, would you walk past or offer your coat without a word? Tell us in the comments.